I believe everyone is here back from the breakout rooms. Good morning. My name is Betsy Page with the Seattle Metro Chamber. And I'd like to welcome you to today's Alaska Business Forum. I hope that those of you that were in those breakout rooms enjoyed the chance to get to know some of your fellow attendees. So I know we have a lot to cover today. I just had a few quick housekeeping things to keep in mind as we're on this great virtual format. So just as a reminder, we are in a Zoom meeting today, so you can share your video and see others on today's call. Please do remember to mute yourself throughout the duration of our program so that we can hear our presenters clearly. And then we will have time for Q&A at the last 20 minutes of our program. So if you have a question, just note that we do not have a Q&A box. So if you have a question, just let us know in the chat, and we will call on you live during that Q&A. You can also let us know with the raise hand feature as well, if that's easier for you. And for those of you on the phone, we will unmute you as well at the end if you have a question. So do take advantage of that. Okay, without further ado, I would like to welcome today's MC, Ephraim, who is our co-chair for Alaska Business Forum. Ephraim, please take it away.
Thanks a lot, Betsy. Happy to be here, everybody. Good morning and welcome to the Alaska Business Forum. I'm Ephraim Freilich, the co-chair of the Alaska Business Forum. I haven't performed many of my duties until today when George had a scheduling conflict, so I had to hop in. So you're getting me today, everybody. I'm a born and raised Alaskan. I've been with the Alaska Business Forum for a little over 2 years now. And you know, I run a policy consulting business here in Seattle. Aqua DC, but I also do work in Alaska, here in Washington and back in DC. So today's forum is one that I've been excited about now each year to get, and I know you are all too. So I'm excited to welcome back Neal Fried and Mouhcine Guettabi for this year's economic update and forecast. There's a lot to discuss after a really unusual year and even an unusual week, I'd say. And before we get started, I want to thank Alaska Airlines, our series sponsor. My friend Scott Haberstad will make a few remarks, and then we will be joined by Rachel Smith, the new president and CEO of Seattle Metro Chamber, to also say a few words. So Scott, welcome and take it away.
Good morning, Ephraim. Good morning, Washington, Alaska, everybody. It's great to be with you guys. I'm going to keep my remarks short because I always love the presentation by Neal and Mouhcine. In fact, I think I saw Neal last month, so I'll be interested to see what's changed between December and January or late November, but it's exciting stuff. Scott Haberstad, Alaska Airlines, proud to be a part, proud to sponsor the Alaska Business Forum. Gonna leave you with just a couple things here. If you haven't seen our safety dance, I didn't like the song when it broke in the 80s, but I think the new ad makes it a much better song. So if you haven't seen the safety dance put on by Alaska Airlines, go to YouTube, check it out. Your children will be dancing around the house like mine, annoying you. Moving on, we were in the breakout session a few minutes ago, and I shared with the folks that were in the breakout session, Alyeska Resort's getting some nice snow right now, and you can fly and ski free with Alaska Airlines at Alyeska Resort and some other places that we serve. So make sure, if you don't have anything going on this weekend, I got lots of seats to Alaska. Hop on a plane, come fly and ski free with us up here. We're talking about turning the economy, making the economy work. That's how we're going to do it, folks. And lastly, I know flying's not on everybody's mind right now, but we've got a great relationship with our CFO. That's not our financial dude. That's Russell Wilson, our chief football officer. And every time he performs on the field, you win. And so I believe Russell's playing this Saturday, and I think he's going to take it to the Rams. And when he does, that means you can save on trips on Alaska Airlines all the way through March. This discount code's going to be. So watch the game, cheer on Russell, take advantage of that. And with that, I'll stop the sales routine. Sorry about that. Now I'd like to welcome Seattle Metro Chamber's new president and CEO, Rachel Smith. I've never met Rachel. I look forward to the day where we can meet in person. And in the breakout room, we were talking about it, asked what can we do or what do we want to see in 21? I look forward to the day where I can comfortably shake somebody's hand again and they're not going to revolt back. Or if I know them well enough to give them a hug. I mean, those are the kind of things I'm looking forward to in 2021. And I look forward to doing that with Rachel. She was named the Chamber's president and CEO of the Seattle Metro Chamber late last year, following an extensive nationwide process led by a special authorized search committee of the Board of Trustees and started this past month. Thank you. Prior to this position, she worked as the King County Deputy Executive and Chief of Staff, where she led the county's policy strategy and execution, oversaw the county's operations in partnership with the executive team, and served the interests of the 39 cities that make up all of King County. And with that, I'll turn it over to Rachel Smith, and I know you guys will all be happy that I won't be talking anymore.
Well, thank you so much, Scott. And that was a very generous and warm welcome. I mean, let's be honest, I'm on day 5, everybody. So I'm very new, but I'm really, I just couldn't be more thrilled to be with you today as the new president and CEO of the Chamber. Like I said, I've made it about a week, so I'm excited about that. And I've honestly really been able to hit the ground running thanks to the great work of the Chamber staff, Betsy and the whole team, board members and members helping to show me the ropes, getting me up to speed on issues, and just providing some really good counsel this week. I know we just have a couple of minutes, so I want to just tell you a little bit about myself, a little bit about what's on my mind for the Chamber here in the coming months, and then sort of have the opportunity to thank all of you. You know, I think there's no shortage of issues to talk about right now. But before I do that, so I am a Tulsa, Oklahoma native. I was born and raised in Tulsa, made my way to the Chamber via California for college. I'm actually a wildlife biologist by trade, which is sort of a unique way to find your way into this kind of work. But after college, I did some work in the nonprofit world, and then ultimately found myself in then Mayor Greg Nichols, Seattle Mayor Greg Nichols' office, where I worked for several years. From there, I spent some time working at Sound Transit. I'm a bit of a transit junkie for those of you that know me. I worked a lot on the ballot measures for Sound Transit 2 and Sound Transit 3, which are the major light rail expansion efforts here in this region, something that I was really enjoyed and really proud of. And then from there, as Scott said, went to King County Executive Dow Constantine's office. I worked as the Director of Government Relations, and then took on the role of Chief of Staff. And then I guess just because he was so persuasive, agreed to be the Chief of Staff and Deputy County Executive, which is the position that I held leading up here to the Chamber. You know, when we think about the future of the Chamber, you know, I stand on some really incredible shoulders, including but not limited to Congresswoman-elect Marilyn Strickland, who I'm so proud to follow in her just exceptional footsteps, Maud Dawn, Markham McIntyre, and the whole Chamber staff. And so while there's a million things that we will be working on, some key focus areas for me are going to be, one, obviously the continued response and response to COVID and recovery. I think the Chamber's just done exceptional work in supporting the business community in getting through this pandemic and continuing to be able to serve customers and work with employees safely. So we want to continue that work. And I really think there's an opportunity now as well for the Chamber to step in and support in vaccine distribution. So that's one of the big conversations that we're having with our government partners right now. We really want to make sure that the business community has access at the right time and that it is seamless access to vaccines. Part and parcel of that, of course, is economic recovery. And I know that's a little bit hard to think about, especially here in Washington State, when we're still sort of in the throes of the restrictions that we have right now. But I think, you know, it is going to be really important, and I can say this from experience, for government to listen to business needs now more than ever as we begin to move into recovery. There are going to be things that we need from government, and then there are going to be things that we need government to not do right now. And so that's a thing we're going to have to navigate. And, you know, I think that economic recovery work is really going to be sort of the defining thing of this, you know, next decade. And so we've got to work hard and we've got to get it right. I think recovering equitably is going to be critical, both because it's the right thing to do, but also because for those communities most marginalized, we simply can't recover and have the gaps get wider. We can't have wage gaps and full employment gaps and skill gaps get worse than they are today. We've got to ensure they get better. And so that is going to be key to our work at the Chamber. And that equity work is going to be robust. We are working with our board's equity committee through all aspects of our work. We're working on diversity goals and membership and different board makeup and ad hoc committees and things of that nature. We really want to increase our inclusion programming for our members, and then really even thinking more about some ways to invest in business retention and expansion efforts to focus on minority-owned business. So I think a lot of really good work that we're going to be able to do this year there. Another thing about me, I'll just say, is I'm an unabashed regionalist. So I will be bringing that to the Chamber's work in everything that we do. I think, we need to really recognize that the communities here in the Puget Sound region and really in the greater region sort of behave as if it's one big city, one big economy. And our work needs to be reflective of how people work in one city, play in another, go to school in another, and live in another. And so I want our work to reflect that. And I really want us to have sort of a robust regional agenda to grow our economy and make things stronger here. And then obviously, I would be remiss without saying that I'm going to be very focused on the health and, sort of the financial and operational health of the Chamber. We, like everybody else, are going through challenges during these times. And I think it is absolutely critical that we stay in a position to provide the services, to be a resource, and to keep up the robust advocacy that we do here at the Chamber. And we can only do that when we're healthy financially and operationally. And then I'll sort of end on just advocacy. I'm glad to have the opportunity to say to all of you right now, I am going to be a fierce advocate for the business community, and that is more important than it has ever been. I am going to be a strategic advocate for the business community, and I am going to increase the influence of the business community in this region. That is my priority. That is what we're going to accomplish, and really can only do that when we're all working together. So I'm just thrilled to have the opportunity to work with all of you. Like I said, I'm learning a lot, and one thing that I have learned in my first 5 days at the Chamber is, of course, that the Alaska Business Forum is one of the Chamber's oldest programs. And I just want you to know that we and everybody else really value the unique opportunity for Alaskan and Pacific Northwest business leaders to meet, to hear about these issues, to talk about issues of importance. And I think the Chamber and I obviously really understand the importance of this relationship, not the least of which is because of the hundreds of thousands of jobs in the region and the billions of dollars in labor earnings that are critical to keeping this economy moving. I want to say thanks again to Scott, and this wouldn't be possible without the support of our sponsor, Alaska Airlines. And, what I understand from the Chamber staff is that this is probably the most dedicated of all of our committees, which just thrills me to no end. So I will stop my remarks there. I wanted to say thank you again to all of you. I'm thrilled to be taking this role over at the Chamber. I really look forward to working with each and every one of you individually. And I hope you have a great rest of the meeting. Thank you. Betsy?
So much, Rachel. I really appreciate it. Virtual round of applause for our new president and CEO, Rachel Smith. Thank you so much for joining us. And I will turn it back to Ephraim.
Thank you so much, Rachel. And it's a pleasure to meet you virtually and to have you here. We're really excited to have you on board. Now I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Mouhcine Guettabi. Mouhcine is an associate professor of economics at the University of Alaska, Anchorage's Institute for Social and Economic Research, where he has been on faculty since July 2012. He holds a joint appointment with the economics department, where he teaches urban and regional economics and health economics. His research interests range from the role of sprawl in affecting health outcomes to econometric modeling at the subnational level. Mouhcine, we're really happy to have you back again, man. Thank you so much for being here. Please take it away.
Thanks for having me. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen. If I can find it. Can you see it?
Yep.
Yeah. Let me go to full screen mode. Well, thanks again for having me. I wish we could be there with you rather than doing this virtually. It's completely dark in Alaska, so hopefully you can see me. But yeah, so it's what I'm going to try to do. I have an ambitious agenda. Unlikely that I will get through all of it, but I've given Betsy the presentation. She can share it with you, and please feel free to reach out. If you have questions or if I say something idiotic and you want to yell at me by email, then please do that as well. So what I'm going to try to do in order not to duplicate what Neal is going to talk about is kind of look at a slightly different angle of the Alaska recovery. There isn't much of it to speak of right now, but what I would like to do is highlight the amount of money that has entered the Alaska economy through federal programs over the last few months and how much that's helped stabilize the situation. As bad as things are, I like to remind people that they could have been much, much worse had it not been for the very aggressive and very timely actions by the federal government. And that's why it's going to be necessary to potentially continue helping businesses in order to mitigate business failures, make sure that when people are allowed to gather again, they're able to gather again, that we can start this recovery with businesses that are somewhat healthy, ones that have kept their balance sheets at least able to operate. And then I'll tell you a little bit about my forecast. So just for transparency, I created a forecast in June in the midst of massive uncertainty. I'll tell you what I got right, what I got wrong, and how things have potentially changed. And then if somehow I have time, obviously Alaska budget issues affect its economy and affect the way businesses operate. And so I'll tell you a little bit about the proposal by the governor. What are the things that are important to keep in mind as we try to navigate 2021? So this in blue will take you to the full forecast that's on the ISER website. Again, this is my June forecast. I've updated portions of it, but I'll tell you essentially how I saw things evolving from June onwards and whether or not we got anything right. Just a very quick summary. This is something that obviously all of you are familiar with, but the pandemic has completely ravaged the Alaska economy. Whether you look at unemployment insurance claims, so if you look at initial claims, meaning these are people or new claims that are being filed every week, terribly boring series. Typically, we average less than 1,000 a week. Since the pandemic, at a point we were at about 15,000. The most recent report shows that initial claims filed are a little over 3,000, but we've averaged since March more than 6,000 per week, which is incredibly elevated. And even though we've been seeing improvements, one of the big takeaways is that it's been very, very sticky. The number of people on unemployment has been very sticky because really we have not had that many catalysts in the Alaska economy that have pushed us out of this prolonged recession. And again, that's not terribly surprising. If you look at the most recent week, there are almost 20,000 people that are on continuing claims or that are receiving unemployment insurance claims. And then there is another 11,000 that's receiving PUA, that's pandemic unemployment assistance. These are gig type workers. So we're looking at more than 30,000 people that are essentially on some form of unemployment insurance. Unemployment rate, a metric that I'm not a huge fan of, has dropped some, but there are questions about the labor force. There are questions about the makeup, what's being counted, what's not being counted, given the allowances that were made for example, gig workers to obtain some aid. And then consumer spending, one of the nice things, if I can refer to it as such, about this pandemic is the fact that it's forced economists, myself included, to look at alternative data sources. And we've been looking at things like consumer spending and foot traffic data in order to better understand how people are responding to restrictions, how they're spending their time, how they're spending their money. one of the resources I've relied on. It's got many caveats that I don't have time to go through, but tracktherecovery.org has data for every state, for most counties in the country, and it captures near real-time spending by sector. And so I encourage you to look at it for Alaska, but also potentially for Seattle, and I'm sure many of you are already familiar with it. So where do I see things going? A year ago, Neal and I stood in front of you and said, oh, the Alaska economy is going to grow, but it's going to grow very slowly. And obviously, we're amazing forecasters, so we predicted the pandemic. No, we didn't, obviously. But we're clearly nowhere near that world, right? And so we thought our forecasts were fairly close to one another. I think I said we're going to grow at 0.7. Neal said we're going to grow at 0.4. And so far, just to give you kind of the takeaway, we're running at about 7%, a little more than 7% fewer jobs than 2019. 2020 is running at about 7% fewer jobs than 2019. That's about 25,000 jobs. In my forecast, obviously, we're gonna turn the corner in 2021. I think we've already hit bottom, barring, again, this new variant exploding and significant delays in the vaccine. We're going to grow in 2021. The problem is that the base from which we're going to be growing is going to be much see right? And so we're going to grow in 2021. We're going to grow in 2022. But at least in my forecast, I do not see us being Alaska, getting back to pre-pandemic levels even by the end of 2023. I think by the end of 2023, we're going to be at about 95% of pre-pandemic employment. The biggest caveat is I'm making a bunch of assumptions here. And unlike many other recessions, there are a lot of policy levers that are at play. So the path of this recovery partially depends on what the Alaska state government decides to do, what the federal government decides to do. There is conversation about $2,000 checks at the federal level. There is conversations about a $5 billion spending package at the state level. And those decisions clearly are going to shift this recovery. How quickly will we be back on planes and cruises and restaurants clearly is gonna determine this path. And as you all know, even though people don't think of the Alaska economy as diverse, there are pockets of the economy that are going to recover much faster than others and already have. Healthcare and social services, healthcare in particular, has recovered quite fast. Again, unsurprising, there was a ton of pent-up demand. There was a lot of delayed procedures that are now being done. And so we're seeing jobs there essentially almost get back to pre-pandemic levels. And I think that the service industry in 2021 is going to do much better just because a big swath of Alaskans, as bad as things are, have saved a lot of money. So people that have been lucky enough to have kept their jobs, have kept their spending down. Most of their spending has been on goods. Spending on services dropped significantly. I think everything that's service related is going to perform well, but again, it's going to be performing well from a fairly low base. So this is a summary of what I just told you. So a 7% drop in 2020, that's about 25,000 jobs. That's the forecast. We're tracking essentially, my forecast is basically on an aggregate basis, tracking where we are right now. That doesn't mean that I get everything right, because I clearly didn't. And then I think 2021 and 2022 are going to see growth. But again, it's really nice to see growth. It's not going to happen in every sector. I'm not very positive about oil and gas. I'm not positive about many pockets of the economy. But I think that we're going to see again this modest growth that's going to get us back on track. And if there are programs that help businesses that could clearly speed up the recovery. And if, for example, this Johnson & Johnson third phase trial ends up being positive, that could speed up the recovery. Maybe we'll have full cruises. I don't know, obviously. As I've said, I want to give you a slightly different perspective. One of the things that I've been paying attention to and I've hinted at is personal income. And this is very loosely defined. This is from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. And it shows you personal income in Alaska, difference between second quarter and the first quarter of 2020. And one of the things that always puzzles people when I talk to them is I say this has been a jobs crisis, not an income crisis at the aggregate level. This doesn't mean that there isn't pain, but the scale of the transfer was so large. So the difference in transfer receipts in Alaska between the second and first quarter was plus $5 billion. And transfer receipts here is very loosely defined, meaning economic income payments, unemployment insurance, boosted payments, PPP. And the net earning losses were about $2 billion. So personal income actually increased between the second and first quarter by about $2.5 billion. Now, again, that doesn't mean that every Alaskan is doing well. That doesn't mean that we don't have a lot of people that are really struggling, but it means that income levels, again, very loosely defined, were higher in the second quarter than they were in the first quarter, something that we wouldn't think about. So I think that that's going to affect this quote unquote recovery quite a bit. If we jump to the third quarter, now look at the difference between the third and the second quarter, that's the orange bars, and the difference between the second and first, those are the green bars. So in the third quarter, what we saw is decline in transfers and gains in net earnings. And so again, that's the period when we were starting to ease some of the restrictions. We were starting to see people starting to go out and spend money, and we saw a little bit of rehiring. However, what we're seeing here is, again, there are two things happening. One is the transfer receipts before this latest $900 billion package were dropping, right? And so for people that are struggling, that's a real problem. We saw the economy recover somewhat, meaning there is hiring, but to me, this says, yes, incomes are higher, but it's clear that there is not going to be an organic type recovery without additional aid. And so that's what I've been saying since March is I think that this is one of the times where I'd rather see governments do a lot more, do much more than, meaning I'd rather them do too much than too little. and so it's very clear to me that even though we're worried about these high savings levels, I think that those high savings levels are going to translate to spending when the economy reopens. And no, I'm not worried about inflation, at least not right now, because interest rates are near zero. But I think it does tell us that this idea of waiting for an organic recovery can potentially be painful. And it also highlights just how incredibly important the actions by the federal government have been in assuring that the economy is at least somewhat stable, even as bad as things have been. And I just want to say that, and I don't want to spend much time on this, this is the share of spending by Alaskans on different categories. But in order to understand one of the reasons why the economy is struggling is that we spend about 8% on outside food. This is basically on anything from takeout to restaurant food. And clearly this has been very, very low over the last few months. We also spend a non-negligible amount on services. That's been very low. And those are the places where I think we're going to see fairly significant spending shocks or increases in 2021, hopefully, if restrictions are eased. But those are also the businesses that have hurt the most. And that's why I think that targeted aid, in order to keep them afloat, in order to make sure that those businesses exist on the other side of this pandemic, is just so incredibly important. I'm just going to skip this. And this is from Track the Recovery. You can get this data. The blue line is Alaska. The gray lines are every other state in the country. And this shows you spending by all consumers in Alaska relative to January. And you can see in every single state in the country, we saw very significant declines in spending. And then we saw this kind of slow increase or slow recovery, but we're still well below January levels. So we're nowhere near a full recovery or a place where Alaskans are comfortable or where businesses are doing the same type of business. So let me quickly pivot to oil. Alaska is still an oil state, whether we believe it or not. Oil prices have recovered a lot. You can see here, this is really interesting. So November is obviously when we got the vaccine news. Oil prices shot up. So the light blue is 2020, the dark blue is 2019. Since the vaccine news, oil prices have shot up. They've hovered over $55 for a little bit, but they ended the year essentially $25 below 2019 levels, right? And so that obviously has implications for jobs, that has implications for the budget. And so, and again, even though we've seen this recovery, if you remember, it feels like 2 years ago, but futures prices hit negative territory. We're nowhere near that now, and we're at that $53, $55 level, but that's still much, much lower than the $65 where we were at in 2019. And jobs lag price recoveries always. The production levels have held up remarkably well. 2020 production basically mirrored 2019 production levels, which is surprising. We averaged a little less than 10,000 barrels per day less, but it's held up much better than prices. But it's remarkable that sector has been hit as hard as it has. And again, I personally do not see it driving us out of the recession. One of the things that whenever somebody reaches out from outside of Alaska and they say, why is Alaska struggling so much? I send them this graph. This graph shows you employment relative to January for Alaska and for the rest of the US. Alaska is the orange line, and the gray lines are the rest of the US. And so this shows you just how seasonal the Alaska economy is, which to me explains a lot of what we've been experiencing. Because in July, employment in Alaska is about 15% higher than it is in January. And that bump in activity that we typically receive just did not happen. It never materialized. And as you can see, hopefully the other gray lines do not experience anything as close to the seasonality that Alaska experiences. So missing out on a summer season complicates this recovery because, again, there are pockets of the economy that are really struggling, tourism-driven businesses, places that rely on sales taxes, on bet taxes, are just hurting, and we don't have a very good understanding of how long they can potentially hang on and what the likelihood is of them making it 2 seasons potentially without this recovery. So I know I'm running short on time. I want to just show you this. I don't know how well you can see it, but this is, it's an ugly graph, but it's my favorite graph that I make for these types of talks because I don't really need to talk about it, right? So it's a sea of red, right? So these are sectoral changes in employment by month relative to last year. And so as you can see, there is just red everywhere. We had bumps in green. Green is good, red is bad, right? And so, and there is a whole lot more red than there is green. Leisure and hospitality, mining and logging, that's basically oil and gas, are just, have been devastated. As I said earlier, this is education and healthcare, mainly healthcare, essentially back to par, which has been really good. Construction's has outperformed my forecast by quite a bit. And then the surprising parts have been local and state government, which for me have held up remarkably well, especially local government. I don't know if that means that there are cuts that are coming and they were just able to keep people on initially. But the question that I ask people, and I don't have an answer to, is what's the catalyst here? When you look at this picture and you think about a recovery, where is this recovery going to come from, right? And so, and that's why I keep referring to government needs to step up, but it needs to step up in a smart way. There needs to be targeted aid to, again, to me, the best bang for our buck is to mitigate business failure and to help people that are struggling most, in order to be efficient with those dollars, but also in order to get us going again, which is incredibly challenging. I know there may be economic developers in the room that have ideas. Alaska certainly needs good ideas. And so And I'm not going to go through sectors, but this is the picture for oil and gas. And again, I'm just showing it to you because it's incredibly ugly, right? And so we're basically 3,000 jobs below where we were last year. And I'm sure all of you have seen the news about Anwar. Not that it was going to save Alaska in 2021 or 2022, but there are challenges, right? Low oil prices, uncertainty, demand questions. Europe is going back into lockdowns. So I'm not smart enough to forecast oil prices, but I can tell you that the outlook is uncertain at best. I think I have 3 minutes, maybe. I'll just tell you about 5 minutes. Okay, perfect. So I'll just tell you about. So again, I created this forecast in June. These are the big assumptions that I make, and I made an assumption that we were going to get a second federal package. I thought we were going to get it a lot sooner than we did. I thought I used our Alaska Department of Revenue's forecast. Meaning low stable oil prices. And then I assume that we're not going to have another round of closures, which we did in Anchorage. And then that we're going to have normalization of travel in 2021, right? Which hopefully we are on the path of that. And Scott is obviously much better placed. We have some TSA data that shows that during Christmas, we were at basically 50% of last year's levels. That sounds low, but that's incredible given where we were in March and April. And so I think that we're heading in the right direction, but there are obviously, for Alaska, there are a lot of headwinds, right? And so again, this is where we are right now. And so I've already shown you the slide, so I'm going to skip it. I showed you this. So this is what the forecast in June looked like, right? And so the green line is 2019, the maroon line, the dashed maroon line is 2022, and the dots are 2021. So again, I'm fairly comfortable with the fact that we've hit bottom, right? And so we're on the way up, but we're on the way up from a very low base, right? And so the question now is this a straight path? The answer is no, right? And so there is no straight path, and it's going to be policy contingent, and it's going to be contingent on the vaccine. So I think I'm encouraged by the fact that there are a lot of developments on the vaccine front, but I think we need to make smart decisions on the policy front. Because I think that we can help this recovery happen faster, happen in a more even manner geographically, industry-wise, if we make the right decisions. But these decisions need to be made fairly quickly. And I want to hold myself accountable. I just said, oh, my forecast showed that we're going to drop 7%. We dropped 7%. Did I get it right? Not sure. You judge, right? And so I thought I was much more pessimistic the first couple of months post my forecast. Jobs held up better because of PPP. But then I thought we were going to get a second round of federal funding faster. We didn't. Jobs in my forecast showed that we were going to be a little bit higher in the August to November period. When you average everything out, again, we're basically going to end the year 25,000 fewer jobs than where we were the year before. And I just want to show you leisure and hospitality. A lot of you come to visit Alaska. A lot of you are involved in this sector in one way or another. I forecast a slow recovery. We don't have a very good sense of when we'll see full cruises. Air travel, car travel will recover faster. Alaska is dependent a lot more on cruises. It's going to be the sector that's going to grow the fastest. Betsy asked me which sectors are going to benefit. Leisure and hospitality on a percentage basis is going to look phenomenal next year. But that doesn't mean that it's going to be back to pre-pandemic levels. It's just because it got crushed, it's going to look like it's growing faster. I think that service sectors, all of them are going to grow fast, but they're going to be growing from a low base. So we need to be careful about not misinterpreting the fact that I have leisure and hospitality growing at 17%, but it dropped by 25% in 2020. And so I think that's important. This is my forecast relative to the actual. Again, I was much more pessimistic in that we were not going to see that bump at all. We did see some of it, but it faded away quite quickly. On average, I think we're right by the end of the year what I thought we were going to be. So I'll finish by showing you this slide. And again, Scott is much better positioned. This is from TSA. this is air travel relative to last year, not just Alaska, but for the country. Everybody pays attention to this. But I think that for anybody that's thinking about, oh, Alaska is tourism dependent, what does this tell us? To me, this gives me a bit of comfort, right? And so there is improvement. People are getting more comfortable. Airlines are doing things to make people more comfortable. And I think that that's the path we're on, right? And so you can see there's much bigger response to holidays here. We even reached 60% of last year's levels at one particular point. So that's where we're at. I'm gonna stop because I'm out of time. I'm happy to answer questions about the budget at the end. I want to give Neal time to speak. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Mouhcine. That was really interesting. We really appreciate it. Now I'd like to welcome our second speaker, Neal Fried. Neal has worked as an economist in Alaska for over 30 years and has observed many changes. Mr. Fried produces economic data and analysis on a variety of economic issues facing Alaska and serves as a speaker on Alaska employment and economic issues at the request of Alaska media organizations, state agencies, and public institutions, as well as nonprofits, corporations, professional associations, and the like. He has served on the Governor's Oil and Gas Policy Task Force, the Anchorage Economic Development Committee, the Governor's Technology Task Force, and others. He is also a member of the Pacific Northwest Economic Conference Board. Neal, really good to see you again. Welcome back, and we're excited to hear your thoughts.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's great. Thank you, Efren, for that introduction. Someone asked me where my bow tie was. I've gained a little weight during COVID, and so my shirts don't close anymore. So I assume that this would be better. This very fancy ascot, which is actually a mask, but. And for some of you that might know, this is a very appropriate old political button, although I don't believe this, I'm not trying to make a political decision, but those of you who've been around long enough might remember this, maybe you won't. Don't have time to explain. I'm going to move pretty quickly. Let me get my slides up first, because I always seem to have problems doing that, although I think maybe it'll work this time. Okay, let's see. Where else do I have to go? Let's see. Can you see those slides?
We can see him, Neal.
Okay, great. Just to say a few things. It's delightful to be here. Although it'd be much more delightful if we were there in person for lots of different reasons. One is you just get that feeling. It's just nice to be in a live setting to do these kinds of presentations. It's more satisfying. And that's why I think we're going to see a nice bounce back in transportation, even business transportation. So Scott, I think you have a lot of good things to look forward to, and you're an optimist anyhow. The other reason it's very delightful in a selfish way is we love to come down to Seattle on Alaska Airlines dime. That's always fun. We have something really to look forward to come to your wonderful city. But again, I think that is going to the pent-up demand thing. And Scott, I just want you to know that my wife got a vaccine yesterday. I get one on Tuesday, so I'll be down there really soon. I'm one of those vulnerable old people. So I am going to move through this pretty quick. Like Mouhcine, I always have too many slides as well. One of the reasons I do that, and I'm not going to get through all of them because Mouhcine has covered a lot of this. A lot of mine's just numbers. We all, a lot of us are very skeptical about forecasts, and that's healthy. And my excuse for only three of my slides today are tied specifically to the 2021 forecast. And there's a couple of reasons for that. And I often do that, and I think a lot of economists do, is one, what happened last year, and it's going to have a big impact on what happens in 21 and 22. And even what's happened in the last decade, as Mouhcine has said, is going to have a big effect on what our future is looking like. So I'll get most of my slides will be tied. And I want you to know that I also have this very important instrument here with me to help me, direct or see into the future, because I've been doing this a long time, and people have a reason to be, and the other reason I'm supplying you with all this data that's not tied directly to the forecast is so that you can actually sort of, decide what you think about Mouhcine's forecast and my forecast, and just, come up with your own. This is sort of gets to a couple of those questions and the future, although it looks like the past. Here it is, this last decade in Alaska has been pretty rough. We just started coming out of a recession in 2019. I mean, Anchorage never did come out of it after 3 years of a lot of job losses. And at the end of 2019, we had already slipped back to where we were in 2010. But we were beginning to recover, and that's one of the reasons why most people last year forecast that we would see growth in 2020. And then you can see what happened in 2020, and it's not that different than the rest of the country. But what that did is sort of pushed us back to where we were somewhere in 2003 or 2004. So we have a long ways to go to recover. I can understand why Mouhcine didn't talk about those previous losses, because it looks pretty grim as far as full recovery, which would take us all the way back to 2015. But it's going to take us a long time to recover just from 2020. Okay. This is what we forecast, and Mouhcine sort of covered this already. His was he was a little more optimistic, and we were a little more pessimistic. And the other thing I want to talk about these numbers over the last decade. I mean, just look at sort of how many, in the good years, when we were still positive, 15, 14, 13, and 12, how much we have to gain, because before that, even though we were growing very modestly. So there's just not a lot of momentum in that. There was not a lot of pre-COVID momentum in our economy, which I think is also going to make us a little more, it's going to make Alaska to recover. It's going to be a little more difficult to recover because we just don't have that pre-momentum recovery that some other places did have. I'm going backwards and that looks kind of crazy, but what I want to say here is this is our recent forecast that came out Monday. So if you want more detail about this forecast, both on a statewide basis, Anchorage, Fairbanks, and Southeast Alaska, you can just type in Alaska Economic Trends and look at the January 2021 issue. Okay, let's now move forward. And this is just the whoops factor. This is our record for past forecasts, which haven't been too bad regularly. But you can see this was a real whoopsie this last year, but I think people give us a pass given what has happened. This is truly, I hate to use the term, a kind of a black swan event. Okay, these are the numbers for 2000, between 2009 and 20, or the COVID losses. Most of them are COVID losses, not all of them. Leisure Hospitality, I'm not going to cover anymore, but you can see it's number one. It's for losses, and that's true around the country. We're not that unique about that. Transportation, I'm going to talk a little about that later on, but that got hit pretty darn hard as well, and probably is familiar in this audience in a big way. Retail, on the other hand, has been losing ground since 2016. So this is just continuing accelerating that trend of loss of retail, much of it to the recession, but also, of course, e-commerce has just accelerated its impact on retail trade. And I'm not sure I'm going to go through any others here, because I'm going to cover this in another way. Let's go to the next slide. This is on a percent basis, which changes the picture a little bit. As you can see, oil moves way up. Oil's a relatively, direct oil industry jobs is not a huge employer. Now, the secondary effects and contraries, it makes it much larger, but they took a really big hit that I think Mouhcine's pretty much covered. And you can see the others here. Like Mouhcine said, healthcare is one of those sectors that has really begun improving a lot. And I'm surprised it's only down 1% because it got hit pretty hard early in COVID and then started coming back. PBS is professional business services. Your seafood, the manufacturing is almost all seafood. I'm going to talk about that a little later as well. But basically every sector in Alaska's economy lost ground except for federal government. And without the 2020 census, which was just temporary, they wouldn't have been positive either. So, and I've even looked, I've looked for really, in this kind of environment, you want to look for some positive employment sectors, and even drilling down to 3 digits and 4 digits. This is 2 digits and 1 digit, but 2 digits in most cases. It's really hard to find, like Mouhcine's graph that he had. I mean, it's just amazing how difficult. I mean, there are some positives occurring, but in the numbers game, man, it's just has been really difficult. This is unemployment. This is the insured unemployment rate, and I wish I had time to talk about it, but Mouhcine kind of explained it for me. We don't like the regular unemployment rate. We never have. It's not a very good economic indicator in Alaska. And it's become even a worse economic indicator, because one thing that's happened in COVID is there's been challenges to collecting and producing a lot of this economic data. We think the unemployment rate has basically exploded right now. We use a national model, everyone does. And so we're turning to this, which is much better, simpler. It's not as broad as your normal unemployment rate. What it's doing is it's looking at people that are receiving unemployment divided by the number of people who could potentially collect unemployment. That would be the denominator. So getting past that, you know, right now the unemployment rate, or insured unemployment rate, is almost 7%. And a year ago, which is that green line, it was about 2%. So you can see the insured unemployment rate is almost 3 times as high as it was last year. And last year was a near record low. So you can just see the dramatic there, and the people that have lost their jobs. This is also unemployment. This one is basically, you can equivalent these to actual individuals here. And this just gives you an idea, and this happened everywhere in the country, how rapidly this occurred. Basically, prior to COVID, we were at very low unemployment and very few people claiming unemployment, again, near record lows. And you can see just 4 or 5 weeks after March of last year, you know, our numbers went up, and equivalent numbers went up to 50,000, so 5 times that. And then these are some of the other groups that are covering the self-employed that we didn't cover the year ago. So it's just the rapidity and I like the term that Mouhcine used. It remains pretty sticky. You can see that August, September, October, December numbers, they have not changed much. They have come down from their peak, but have not changed much. This here is just looking at previous recessions in Alaska and sort of comparing them to what's happened now. This one, of course, is not over yet, but you can see in numerics, maybe not as a percent basis yet, but even the number of jobs lost within 1 year is greater than what we had in our 1980s when we had our classic bust in our economy. The other interesting thing about these recessions is this current one is probably the only one really that was similar and happened at the same time as recessions elsewhere in the country, in the nation. Usually, or very often, the nation might be in a recession, we're doing okay, or we're doing really well, and vice versa. I don't think it's counter-cyclical, it's because the structure of our economy is very different. But this time around, we're looking very much like elsewhere in the country. Mouhcine's already shown this. You can see if you go back even further than Mouhcine was talking about, and go to the previous peak, and the only peak in our oil industry employment, you can see, you know, we're at a little less than, or a little more than half of that previous peak. And that previous peak was not that long ago. Here's, you know, we all know that different parts of the state are experiencing different things. And I'm just going to point out a few. And it's largely because the structure of their economies are all different, or very different. The place that's been hurt the worst, and I actually came up with a new graph for Southeast. No, this is good. Has been really hit very hard, largely because of the rapture of the visitor industry last year, especially when we're talking about the cruise ships, you know, losing, you know, 15% of jobs. And then they got hammered a second time this year. To add insult to injury, they had a terrible fishery this year in volume and in price. On the flip side, you have a place like Southwest Alaska, which is Bristol Bay, the Aleutians, and other parts, where they don't have a very large service sector. Like Mouhcine said, that most of our job losses are in that service sector. They don't have much of one. This is very tied to fishing and government. And so they've done a little bit better. They've lost a lot less ground. And that's true in most of rural Alaska. But of course, in many cases, employment availability in many of those places is pretty tough. And then you have Anchorage sitting there and other parts. Gulf Coast is the Kenai Peninsula, Valdez, Cordova, and Kodiak. And I have to move on. And Mouhcine already talked. This is the oil prices. You know, today they were, I think, a 54, 55, and they've been in the 50s. I didn't think I'd ever celebrate $40 oil, which I did. Now I'm celebrating $50 oil. Here's, you know, one actual bright spot, both from an employment standpoint and other points, is mining. This is just basically the hard rock mining and Healy and a few others. But this is mostly hard rock mining. It's done remarkably well. And I agree with Mouhcine. I think sometimes I think our economy is a little more diverse than a lot of people think. Everyone thinks it's just oil and the federal government and some fishing or something. There's more to it. I mean, this is a relatively small sector, but done well, even though they've had some real challenges because of COVID, but they've done remarkably well. And of course, commodity prices are pretty nice right now and have been for a while. This is another sector that's done quite well. And actually, we're seeing some growth largely because of what's happened with the F-35s in Fairbanks. The troops are beginning to arrive now this year. They actually are coming. They're coming more slowly than they expected because of COVID. But this is sort of another positive that's actually occurred in 2020. And then here's fishing. It's a kind of a depressing story. If you want to read about, I mean, a lot of pandemic and other challenges they had. And then to add insult to injury, in this case, prices, particularly for salmon, were very poor. The harvest was lousy, but in a few places it was pretty decent, like Bristol Bay. We don't have the harvesting employment yet. Those numbers lag. And this one, I love this data. The sad thing about this is this data may be going away. They don't know whether they're going to renew the contract or not. I hope they do. And maybe Scott can convince the Anchorage International Airport to continue with some of these cool numbers. This is, you know, the number of people that get frisked by the Homeland Security every week. And this is the most current I have, but you can see it went up to 90% fewer passengers for part of the year, and it has improved and probably will continue to improve. But these are the most recent, and this is through the Anchorage International Airport. I just wanted to put together a little bit on transportation because I know how important that is to this audience. And transportation got hit really hard. Remember, we lost 9% of our jobs, and transportation, you can see got hit by 17%. You can see scenic and sightseeing just got slaughtered. That, of course, is tied to the visitor industry. Water transportation, which many of you are involved with, did okay. But there's a challenge there in employment because a lot of that employment is actually in Washington and Oregon, not in Alaska. And then trucking did okay, and air transportation, of course, got hit pretty darn hard as well. Here's real estate, like everywhere. This isn't real estate. Just gives you an example. This is a bed taxes collected in Anchorage, and just again, is sort of a representative of what's happened to the visitor industry last year, and has other ramifications as well. Here's the real estate industry, and like a lot of other places, we've been pretty surprised about how well, this is residential real estate, how well that sector has done. I mean, it's pretty amazing, particularly for older Alaskans or Alaskans that were here in the 1980s, when we had actual, housing trauma. Because of the number of, because of what happened to our housing market, basically collapse. And so every time our economy goes through a hiccup or a recession, we always think, oh my gosh, is that going to happen again? But in most recessions, those kinds of things are not nearly as dramatic, but that is some history that does affect our outlook. But it's done quite well. The third quarter was particularly good, but I understand that's working that way in a lot of other places as well. It's not unique to us. Part of it's the kind of income we have, and there are other theories behind it. Vacancy rates are going up. This last vacancy rate was before COVID when we measured it in March. But, as you know, our population's decreasing some. More people are moving into homes, so it's not surprising vacancy has been climbing in Alaska and Anchorage and elsewhere. It's an interesting factor. It's kind of a bifurcated market. It appears that rents are coming down while prices of homes are going up. In Anchorage, I think they went up about 6% last year. But But that's not happening in the residential market. And that's, again, that's sort of an experience that's happening in a lot of places. My son has been up here since June. He normally lives in San Francisco the last 6 or 7 years. Just the other day, his friends called him up. He said on a drunk call, got together to convince him to come back to San Francisco because they miss him. And one of their attractions they were using was rent has really dropped in San Francisco, not the price of new homes. So it's not just here. Now, our rent's a little bit different. We have not seen that big drop that other places have. And then foreclosures are a non-issue, which isn't surprising because houses sell quickly right now. And let me say one other thing, because I guess I don't have that. Building permits, we built more houses, at least in Anchorage, this year than we have in 5 years, or permits. And there's even anecdotal information that more $1 million homes were built in Anchorage just last year than ever before. Now, we built about 480, 490 new permits, or had permits. It's the best in 5 years, but it's still pretty darn low compared to the historical numbers. This is another cool set of data, kind of like the other data I share with you, except this is one of the big positives in Alaska right now is air cargo. As you can see, those numbers are up as high as 50% over a year ago. You know, the FedExes, UPSs, Atlas Airs, and others have really benefited from COVID because of the material coming from Asia, because passenger planes, because there are few of them, are carrying less cargo, so there's less competition, and e-commerce. So this has been a real, nothing but a plus, especially in Anchorage's economy. Here's something that just happened yesterday. These numbers were just put out before I wanted to leave and go home, so I had to stay a little later. But you can see our population in 220 fell 1%, about 1%. The details, we had 9,900 births, 4,600 deaths, of 4,600, very similar to last year's numbers. In fact, just to be morbid, our deaths in 2020 were less than 2019. And then the net migration was 8,308. And we haven't been able to look and study these numbers very much, but we have to just remember that when we talk about negative about migration, what people visualize often is that just means that everyone's leaving. But that's not true. In this case, a bigger factor is the number of people coming. And that's been a bigger factor in our lost population than out-migration compared to previous trends. Now, we were all interested what was going to happen to migration with COVID. And we're not still quite sure, these are the numbers, but how that happened, because migration has been declining for years across the country, people moving, and we thought that would have declined a whole lot this year. I think it did decline some this year. And when migration declines, it's probably not good for Alaska in general, because we depend so much on population coming to our state. And here's a forecast story. We think it's going to grow by 3%. But again, like Mouhcine said, we're coming from a very, very low base. Here's the actual numbers. So you can see by these numbers why we expect a recovery, at least to 2015 levels, will take a while, but it's just nice, positive. I mean, hopefully we'll be moving into that. I'm going to be estimating Anchorage's employment today for December, and it's going to be interesting to see, because like the national report, we might take another hit because we were closed down or partially closed down in December. Here is our detailed forecast where most errors are made. As you can see, we expect leisure and hospitality to grow nicely, but it'll take a while for it to totally recover. Retail will never recover, I don't think, to its previous levels, and that's because of e-commerce, and that's happening around the country. Transportation, nice boost in that one, and you can see the others as well. And I hope Mouhcine gets a chance to talk about the budget. It's a big one, but you can see how what we think of state government, what's going to happen there with the university. And local government's interesting. That's mostly school districts. And part of that increase is, for example, in Anchorage, the decline in local government was all tied to we didn't have any substitute school teachers yet. I'm not going to talk about this. I've talked about it before. It's just, I think Alaska is looking and Anchorage more attractive on a cost of living basis relative to a lot of places. And that might be a nice fundamental structural change that will help us. Here's another, just a weird set of data. We all year long, we've been experiencing deflation in the Anchorage urban area, or the Alaskan urban area, mostly Anchorage. Though we only have one more data point to come up with, and that's in December. So we may be actually have deflation up here. Whether it's real or not is a different question, but lots of contracts are tied to it. So it'll be interesting. We're one of the only places, or the only place in the country that might experience that for the year. And it'll be the first time in Alaska. And here's the most important data is how we're doing as far in the drinking world in Alaska. And you can see COVID took a hit for most sectors, and that's almost, I think, tied to the lack of a visitor sector, because starting in September and October, most of these numbers turned positive again when the visitor sector was no longer playing a big role. And you can see some things are taking harder. The craft beer, for example, which was growing nicely before this, like a lot of other places, took a big hit for the same reason that happened in Seattle and other places. Wine less, and strangely, liquor has done quite well, even though we didn't have any visitors. I don't know what we're doing at home these days. And then here's marijuana. This is another bright spot, I guess you could say. You know, that sales have increased dramatically all through COVID. We got an extra PFD, all these extra, you can often see a little bump in that, but July was the largest or the biggest sales month since marijuana has been legalized in Alaska. And they're probably filling a lot of that empty retail space, or one of the big ones that have filled some of that empty type of retail space. And those are, all the remarks that I have, and hopefully we can fill in gaps with questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Neal, and thanks again, Mouhcine. There was a lot there, and there's a lot of that I get a little depressed about, but also there's some bright spots there. And so I'll ask a question here in a moment, but as a reminder for everybody, there's no Q&A box today, but please let us know if you have a question in the chat or through the raise hand feature on Zoom. Betsy and I will try to see it and call on you, and you can ask your question live, but please remember to unmute yourself when you're called on. And so I heard both of you mention the 2015 level, but could you talk a little bit more about what kind of timeline we are on to get to the 2015 level? Neal, I mean, I saw you at the end there. It was a 3% growth prediction there, but with an 8.5% drop preceding it, and so I realize it's going to take a while, but are you guys making those type of predictions right now or forecasts?
Mouhcine's been the only brave one to go out past 1 year. We've only forecasted at 1 year points, but I think you can see, and maybe the pent up demand and other things will make the recovery happen earlier. But I think when you just look at the data and you look at the momentum that we had in this economy before COVID, which wasn't a whole lot, it will take probably, like Mouhcine said, I think 2 or at least 3 years. Even if we get. And we have to have 2 or 3% growth a year to get there. And we haven't had 2 or 3% growth for a long time.
Yeah, so when we spoke to you guys last year, I think I showed the slide. I mean, this was pre-pandemic, where I was explaining that it was going to take Alaska 7 or 8 years of growing at about 0.5% to get back to 2015 levels, right? So this is pre-pandemic. It was going to take us basically 7 or 8 years to just recover the 11,000 jobs that we lost because of the oil crisis. So I think that we're looking at a decade at least. I mean, again, barring significant shocks. The thing that I mentioned earlier is it's a catalyst question, right? And so what's the driver that's going to get us that 2% growth that we haven't had in multiple years? And it's really hard to see unless something changes dramatically, which seems to happen in Alaska.
I appreciate that. And before we open it up, one more question for me. So I see, and I mentioned this in my breakout session with my group. One of the biggest input variables is getting to critical mass for vaccine distribution. And I've seen that number vary from 60 to 65 to 70%. And those timelines are unclear, right? But have either of you looked at what those variables would mean, what critical mass by August 2021 looks like, or what, and how that changes the rate at which we recover? Is that an input that either of you are looking at? It's hard to predict. I know you do have a crystal ball on your desk though, Neal.
Yeah, but I think Mouhcine has looked at this question much deeper in the timing with COVID. I'll just say one thing is it is going to be so critical for our visitor season because of the timing. I mean, it's more critical than Hawaii, or because they have tourism all year. So that seasonal graph that Mouhcine showed, are we going to get that this year or not? And I think that's just going to be super critical for us. And let's just hope it works out better than it did last year.
Yeah, I think that, it's a couple of things. One, I mentioned in my remarks that I think that the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, I think, could help speed up the distribution quite a bit and could change the landscape. The other thing is I think about groups of people, right? And so again, the visitor sector benefits from an older population. That's a question of comfort more than it is vaccinations, right? So they're being prioritized. So I think that most people over the age of 65 or 60 are going to be vaccinated between now and March. The question is, do they have resources? How are their balance sheets? And are they comfortable traveling? And those are survey type questions. And how good does the cruises and the airlines, how good of a job do they do to convince them that it's safe? And are they comfortable? And I don't have a good handle on that, right? And so I think that there is a ton of pent-up demand. There is a lot of data points that tell us that people are ready to gather, right? And so it's just a matter, as you said the important word, it's scale, right? And so, because as Neal said, these communities got devastated. So a season at 20% is going to help, but I'm not sure that businesses can do 48 months or 24 months at 20% levels, right? And so I'm fairly optimistic that, again, we are going to have a summer season, again, barring something crazy. But the logistics and the size of the season, we were looking at record tourism pre-COVID. I don't think we're going to get back to that, right? And so for at least a couple of years, but we are, I guess we're at the mercy of these developments that are outside of our control, right? Which is difficult. And that's why I said policy matters. I would like to see the state do a lot in order to kind of mitigate some of these business failures in the event where some of these people do not actually get on those cruises and travel.
I think now we're going to open up to a few other questions from our participants. So I had a question from Ron Peck. Ron, if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
I just want to thank Neal and Mouhcine. This is, you guys do an awesome job. I really appreciate it. And I just wanted to address home values just real quickly. And for either one of you, do you think it's because boomers are staying and they've got that discretionary income? And so they're not, plus the cost of money? That was my first question. And then just one comment. I just really appreciate what you both said about the tourism season. I know Scott knows this, but at the end of the day, we already know the cruise lines are going to do everything, just as the carriers have, to make the operation safe and healthy. But they've already stated, the season usually starts end of April, May. Holland America is not coming till June. So that is going to impact the numbers. And thank you. So any comments about home values?
Well, the home, I just did a podcast with a guy in my office yesterday for an hour and a half. He was a younger fellow and he wasn't doing too well in the social distancing world, but we did it anyhow. And, I think for the same reason Alaska's happening elsewhere, and it's not just happening here, but it's happening in other places. Like Mouhcine said, income's been doing well. I don't think it's just baby boomers. I think a lot of the millennials now that have, that have good jobs, are forming families. They want homes, and everyone used to write them off, but that's not true. There's a lot of that in the more affordable housing area. So, but when we look at our numbers, I mean, they're strong, not strong, but they're a little bit better than last year. But they're not, they were a lot better 5 or 6 years ago. But it's just the reason why it kind of sticks out is when you have a recession that's this deep and job loss is this large, it's still surprising. But we have to remember that a disproportionate number of the jobs lost were with people with low wages, lower incomes that were probably less likely to buy a home than the other group.
Yeah,
but that's all speculation. And interest rates. The real estate folk thought it was mostly real estate. I mean, were interest rates.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I mean, over the last few years, I've said multiple times, we don't have a great way of checking it, but you all know this. There are a lot more multi-generational families, right? And so that makes population a lot stickier. You mentioned that. I think that income of older people coming from non-Alaska specific sources creates a floor. Income from native corporations create a floor. And I think that Neal touched on this. As bad as things have been, we have the largest portion of the population that's kept their jobs, kept money, kept savings. And then I would be remiss not to mention that I think we don't know the depth of the housing crisis because of the policy programs, right? There's been forbearance programs, there's been mortgage freezes. And so nobody, aside potentially from the banks, has a very good handle on the balance sheets of households and how many of them potentially will default. And I will just close by saying, even though we've lost population, because everywhere else in the country is struggling, it's not like there is this uneven distribution of opportunity, right? So Alaska struggles when Seattle is doing phenomenally well, and we see out migration towards it. Right now, there are lockdowns everywhere, so nobody is leaving. I mean, again, we lost population, but we're not leaving in hundreds of thousands. So I think that the next 12 months are going to be very telling as we see an uneven recovery and we see potentially places recover a lot faster. So we both mentioned oil and gas struggling. It's struggling all around the country, right? A lot of people lost their jobs, but it's not like they can move to Houston and get a job, right? And so, but it's, I think that I would close by saying the picture is still murky because of the policy programs, which makes me hesitate to say that the strength is truly organic.
Okay, thank you. Next, we have a question from Chris Barrows. Chris, if you're on, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, thanks, Betsy. And I typed this up. It's in the chat, actually, and I typed it up before Neal kind of spoke to some elements of the seafood industry. But I guess I was a little surprised because what I expected to hear was that amongst, and relatively speaking, amongst different industries in Alaska, that seafood may have been a bit of a bright spot in 2020, and maybe because of the lagging indicators of some of that industry, maybe that's not reflective yet, but I didn't hear that. And so I just wanted to, I think that the subtext of my question is, did I hear that wrong, or is it not just reflective yet? And I wonder if they're going to just be a little bit of additional explanation on that component. And my question was largely related to the fact that early in 2020 there was a real question of whether that the harvesting would even and the seasons would occur at all, right? And there was a huge public partnership, private partnership with the administration, and I really give the administration a lot of credit for putting down the marker that we will have harvesting seasons. The question is to what degree and how safe are they going to be, and we're going to work toward being as safe as possible. And they achieved that, I think, largely speaking. And so that was kind of the subtext of why I expected to kind of hear that in an economic and labor context. And I'm just wondering if I'm missing anything, or if you can expound upon that. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I don't think you're missing anything, but you do point out something important, especially in the early and towards April, May, whether we were going to even have one. And I think I agree with you. We pulled it off pretty well. We have a whole article about that, the struggles. But, you know, even if we were in a non-COVID year, I mean, you know, fish harvest and values change all the time, quite dramatically. So I think even if we didn't have COVID, it would not have been that different. It was better, I think, than most of us expected, just because of the challenges and whether we were going to have a season for salmon and some of the other fisheries. But I think still, the impact this year, because of the harvest and prices, is going to be less than it was last year. And in other years, it was lower than this. And so there are a couple of things going on here. And one of the reasons a lot of the prices were poor was because of COVID around the world, particularly around the U.S. But you know, the numbers didn't fall nearly as hard as some of us might have thought. Obviously, if we didn't have a season, and it was, I agree with you, we pulled it off pretty well.
Great. Yeah, just a few minutes left. I have a couple more questions I'm going to try to get through. I have one from Larry Serrano. Larry, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
This is a question for Mouhcine. When you were explaining and tracking Alaska crude oil prices, you mentioned that, at least for a short time, oil prices got into negative territory, which maybe I'm small-minded, but I'm having a hard time getting my mind around that you could actually have negative territory for a crude oil price. So could you explain that?
Yeah, your comment essentially already answered the question. Storage facilities were so full, you literally had to pay people for a short period of time. I mean, these are futures prices, and so you had to pay people in order to hang on to oil. And so demand had plummeted, and there were barrels of oil that basically did not have takers. And so we were for a short period of time in this very crazy space with no demand. Supply was still flowing, and there were no takers. And so for a short period of time, essentially, there was almost like think about it as the opportunity cost of holding a barrel of oil.
So you had oil and no place to put it.
That's a much better, concise way of saying it. Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Larry. Okay, I think we have time for one more question, and it is from our trusted chair, George Rowe, who is back on the call. George, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thanks very much to both of you. I am so looking forward to watching the recording of your comments. It sounds like an amazing dialogue. But the question that I've got is, like, I'm always looking for opportunities in the middle of really difficult challenges. And so when we think about Alaska has great potential in its people, its places, its infrastructure that's already there. Can you see, how do you see this situation that we're in right now? How can we double down? One of you, I think it was Mouhcine, talked about the policies. How are the policies? How can we help ourselves diversify our economy, build capability that when market does come back for a variety of things, we can really be players?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. So I think that we've been prisoners to myopic thinking because the crisis has been so big, right? And so budget, let's make sure that we give aid. I think part of it is, again, to double down on economic strengths by region. Think about supply chain questions. You guys think about supply chain a lot. I think localization of the supply chain makes a big difference. I think obviously renewable energy is a place that I think Alaska could make headway in. I think even leisure and hospitality, I think tourism, there are a lot of opportunities. I think exploiting natural amenities or taking advantage of natural amenities in order to link up Alaska 2.0 or to create drivers for Alaska 2.0, I think are going to have to go through an amenity-driven vision, if you will. So it's resources, right? So we have renewable and non-renewable resources. I don't know what's going to happen to oil. I know that fish is going to be here, right? And I know that Alaska's beauty is going to be here. And so I think that those are catalysts. I said earlier, there are no catalysts. I think that those are two places where you can think a lot about how do you maximize benefits to local areas? How do you work with native corporations? How do you have a more ownership stake in some of these industries? There are big conversations right now about how to use the permanent fund and should there be private-public partnerships and all of that. And I'm in favor of those conversations. I know that makes a lot of Alaskans uncomfortable, but I think that they need to happen because, again, finding organic growth right now is going to be challenging. So, I mean, that would be my way of thinking about it.
The only thing I'd like to add to that is that I think the visitor industry is a really good example. Here's the industry that's been hit the hardest by a long shot, or almost the hardest, them and oil, but it obviously has the most potential for growth because all the other trends that were going on before this, those trends are going to probably return. And given the size of the state, and I was in Iceland fairly recently, where they get far more visitors, and it's this tiny little island. I don't understand it. We have a lot better looking resources and diverse resources than Iceland does. So I think the potential there is that's an easy one that's there, and everything's moving in the right way for that industry, I think. In the future, after we get through COVID, a lot of the other ones are going to be a big struggle and have some big barriers.
Thanks to both of you. Appreciate it.
All right. Well, we are at time. I just want to say thank you so much to Neal and Mouhcine for joining us today. They're always so generous with their time to join us every January. It feels weird not to be in the same city as you guys, but maybe in 2022 we will be together again. And I also want to thank Ephraim and George, our Alaska Business Forum co-chairs, for helping this come together. So just as a reminder, you guys all know that we have another forum next month, February 12th, on understanding climate legislation. I do have some good news, which is our pricing has adjusted a bit. So it's actually going to be free for chamber members for Alaska Business Forum to attend, and then $10 for non-members. So even easier for you guys to attend. This session was recorded, and I will send out the recording as well as the PowerPoint so you can review all the great information that was shared today. So thank you again to Alaska Airlines for sponsoring. Thanks for coming. Enjoy your Friday, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks.